All right, so today we're diving into a topic that's really kind of at the forefront of everyone's minds right now, the whole world of sanctions and, how they're impacting Russia and really kind of the global energy market.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about this is, everyone talks about sanctions as, this big tool that countries can use to influence each other. But when you really look at what's happening with Russia, it's kind of a different story than what a lot of people expected.
Yeah, you always hear sanctions are going to be this silver bullet. And, Russia's economy is going to just, totally collapse. But, we've got a bunch of sources here that we've been digging through. And it really seems like the reality is a lot more complicated.
Yeah. One of the things that really surprised me when I was looking into all this was that despite all the predictions of, Russia's economy tanking, they've actually been pretty resilient.
It's kind of crazy, right? I mean, you think back to, all the headlines. Like right when this all started, and I was like, "Oh, Russia's economy is going to fall apart," and they're going to be this and that. But then when you actually look at the numbers,
yeah,
and sort of what's happening, it's like they're not just surviving; they're finding ways to kind of thrive.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that has been their ability to pivot. They've been shut out of a lot of Western markets, but they've really ramped up trade with Asia. I mean, energy exports to China and India have skyrocketed.
So it's almost like instead of isolating Russia, sanctions have kind of pushed them closer to some other major players.
Yeah.
In the global economy.
Yeah, it's a classic case of unintended consequences.
Right.
You try to close off one avenue and you just open up another.
So, okay, the sanctions might not be crippling Russia's economy the way people thought they would.
Okay.
But what about like the ripple effects, beyond Russia itself?
Yeah, well, that's where things get really interesting. I mean, just look at what's happened with the European energy market. Russia's halt of gas flows through Ukraine has really, sent shockwaves through the entire system.
It's like, you pull one thread on a sweater and the whole thing starts unraveling.
You got countries like Slovakia and Hungary who are hugely dependent on Russian gas.
Yep.
And now they're scrambling to find alternatives, and it's not cheap. And that's created this kind of domino effect where everybody's competing for limited resources and energy prices are through the roof all across Europe.
So the sanctions might not be hitting Russia as hard as intended, but they're definitely causing pain, in other places.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting because it's not like the gas has stopped flowing completely.
Right. It's just found a different route.
Which brings us to this whole Azerbaijani gas situation.
What?
It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
I know, right?
So on the surface, it looks like, Azerbaijan is just, stepping up to fill the gap left by Russia, providing gas to Europe.
Yeah, through pipelines that, bypass Ukraine.
But it sounds like there's more to this story.
Yeah, the devil's in the details.
Ooh, I knew it.
So yeah, this gas is technically coming from Azerbaijan. But if you look at the pipeline route, it goes through southern Russia. And get this, through the occupied Donbas region of Ukraine.
Wait a minute. So gas that's being labeled as Azerbaijani is passing through territory controlled by Russia.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty big loophole.
It is. It raises a lot of questions about, where this gas is really coming from.
Yeah.
And whether Russia's, secretly profiting from it.
So even if it's technically Azerbaijani gas, the money might end up back in Russia's pockets.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, think about the transit fees alone. It's like a shell game,
Yeah.
moving the gas around to make it look like it's coming from somewhere else.
Exactly. And it really shows how hard it is to enforce sanctions in, a globalized world. Resources can flow through so many different channels. Yeah, this whole situation is just like this crazy mix of economic interests and political maneuvering and energy security.
It's all tangled up together.
Yeah. So let's talk about the political side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the big moves happening on the chessboard? And who are the players making them?
Well, one of the biggest changes is obviously the new leadership in the U.S. With President Trump back in office, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's stance on Russia has always been a bit of a wild card, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, during his campaign, he was pretty skeptical about sanctions. He even hinted that he might lift them if he was elected.
So there's a chance that sanctions against Russia could be, eased or even totally removed.
It's possible.
That would be a huge shift.
It would, but it's not that simple.
No, I figured.
Even if Trump wanted to lift sanctions, he's going to face a lot of pushback from Congress.
Right.
A lot of lawmakers are still committed to maintaining pressure on Russia, no matter what the president thinks.
So even if Trump wants to go one way, he might not be able to help.
Yeah, it's a classic case of checks and balances in action. The president can't just act unilaterally on foreign policy, especially when it's something as controversial as this.
So we've got this whole web of, energy flows and economic maneuvering and political posturing. But let's step back for a minute and think about the bigger picture. What does all this mean for the conflict in Ukraine? Are sanctions actually helping to end the war and bring about peace?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's a lot of debate about it.
Yeah,
I mean, some people say sanctions are absolutely necessary to pressure Russia into changing course. But there's another side to this argument that's starting to gain some traction.
Okay, lay it on me.
There's a growing concern that sanctions might actually be making things worse.
Wait, how could sanctions possibly make the conflict worse?
Well, the argument is that by hitting Russia with these harsh economic measures, you actually risk hardening positions on both sides, fueling resentment, and making it even harder to reach a negotiated settlement.
So it's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Kinda, yeah. By inflicting pain on the Russian people, you might actually be strengthening their support for their government, even if they don't agree with what's happening in Ukraine.
That's a scary thought. So instead of pushing Russia towards peace, sanctions could be pushing them further away?
It's a complex issue. There are no easy answers. And to really understand it, we need to look at Ukraine's position in all of this.
Okay.
They recently made a decision that's pretty interesting. On the one hand, it makes sense. But on the other hand, it kind of raises some eyebrows.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So Ukraine has agreed to allow the transit of non-Russian gas through its territory.
Okay.
Now, from an economic standpoint, this makes total sense.
Right.
They desperately need the revenue from transit fees.
Especially with the war going on.
Exactly. Their economy's been hit hard.
Gotta keep the lights on.
But here's the thing. Remember, they were totally against allowing Russian gas to flow through their pipelines.
Right.
But now with this Azerbaijani gas, which we know might not be what it seems, it kind of looks like they're softening their stance.
Like they're walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
Trying to balance their economic needs with their political principles.
Exactly. They're in a tough spot. And they've got to factor in the needs of their European allies who are desperate for gas.
Right.
And then there's the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
They've been putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine to, play ball.
So Ukraine's stuck in the middle trying to keep everybody happy.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Man, this is giving me geopolitical whiplash.
Yes.
So we've got Russia seemingly weathering the storm of sanctions, Europe scrambling for energy, Ukraine caught in the middle, and the U.S. with a new president who could change the game entirely. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's the question everybody's trying to figure out. And I think the key is to understand that. Sanctions are just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. They're not a magic bullet. And, their effectiveness really depends on a whole bunch of factors, like the global political climate, how resilient the target economy is, and whether other countries are willing to actually, cooperate and enforce them.
So it's not as simple as saying, sanctions work or sanctions don't work. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's not a black and white situation. Sanctions can have all sorts of effects, both intended and unintended. And those effects can vary wildly depending on the context.
So if we're trying to figure out the real impact of sanctions on Russia, we can't just look at the economic numbers. We got to consider the political calculations, the strategic maneuvering, and the long-term implications for, the whole global balance of power.
Right. And that's where things get really interesting because, there's this argument that's gaining traction that sanctions, especially when it comes to Russia, might be less about, achieving some immediate political goal and more about kind of shifting the playing field of international energy.
Okay, now you got my attention. Explain that one.
Well, think about it. Energy is power, right? It fuels economies, it drives industries, it shapes geopolitical relationships. And Russia, as a major energy exporter, they've always had a lot of leverage in this arena.
Yeah, they've definitely used their energy resources as a political tool to exert influence over countries that are dependent on their gas and oil.
Exactly. But sanctions, even if they haven't completely crushed the Russian economy. They've forced them to rethink their whole energy strategy. They've had to diversify their markets, find new partners, and come up with alternative routes for their exports.
So in a way, sanctions are kind of forcing Russia to play a different game in the global energy market.
Exactly. They're having to adapt to be more flexible and to find new ways to maintain their influence. Yeah. And I think that's really where the true significance of sanctions lies. It's not necessarily about bringing Russia to its knees economically, but about nudging them, even if it's subtly towards a different position in the global energy landscape.
Fascinating. It's like a giant game of energy chess, and sanctions are just one move in a much bigger match.
That's a great way to put it, and it highlights the fact that we need to think about sanctions strategically, not just tactically. It's not just about punishing Russia in the short term. It's about shaping the long-term dynamics of the global energy market.
So where does this leave countries like Ukraine, who are caught in the middle of this energy chess match?
Well, for Ukraine, it's all about balance. They're trying to reduce their reliance on Russian energy, but they also need the transit fees from those pipelines that cross their territory. It's a tough position to be in.
And they're not alone, right? I mean, Europe is dealing with its own energy security concerns.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is trying to figure out, what its role is in this whole evolving energy landscape.
Yeah.
It's like everyone's trying to find their footing in a world where the rules of the game are constantly changing.
Yeah, and that's the point. We're in a period of transition, a time of uncertainty, where all those old assumptions about energy and geopolitics are being challenged. And sanctions, while they're just one piece of this larger shift, are playing a major role in reshaping the global energy order.
So if sanctions are less about immediate economic pain and more about, this long-term strategic maneuvering, what does that mean for the possibility of peace in Ukraine?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. I don't think sanctions alone are going to, magically bring about a quick resolution to the conflict. But they could, over time, help to shift the balance of power and create conditions that are more favorable to a negotiated settlement.
It's like a slow burning fuse. You might not see the impact right away, but eventually it's going to have a big effect.
Yeah. Exactly. And we can't forget that sanctions are just one tool in the diplomatic toolbox. They need to be part of a bigger strategy. That includes things like diplomacy dialogue and a real willingness to address the root causes of the conflict.
So it's not just about, squeezing Russia economically.
Yeah.
It's about engaging with them, diplomatically understanding their perspective, and finding ways to create a more stable and secure environment for everyone involved.
Exactly. And that requires a nuanced understanding of the complexities,
Yeah.
a willingness to move beyond simple narratives, and a real commitment to, pursuing a multifaceted approach to peace building.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. But I think you've really hit on something important. We can't just look at sanctions in isolation. We need to see them as part of this bigger geopolitical and energy chess game with moves and counter-moves that have far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to be well informed, to seek out different perspectives, and to really think critically about these complex issues.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the rhetoric, but it's crucial to step back, analyze the deeper dynamics at play, and consider the long-term consequences of our actions.
Exactly. And I think that's the key takeaway from all of this. Sanctions are powerful, but they're not a cure-all. They have to be used strategically, thoughtfully, and in conjunction with other diplomatic efforts. And we need to be aware of the unintended consequences, both in the short term and in the long run.
So it's not just about turning the screws on Russia. It's about understanding this intricate web of energy economics and geopolitics that's shaping this conflict and finding a way to, untangle it.
Exactly. And that takes a level of sophistication and nuance that's often missing from the public debate.
Well said. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on sanctions and the complexities of international energy. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the possibility that sanctions could actually make the conflict in Ukraine worse.
Right. It's a controversial idea,
Yeah.
but one that I think is worth considering.
I'm really curious to hear more about that. Could you elaborate on the potential downsides of sanctions, specifically how they might impact peace efforts?
Sure. One of the main concerns is that sanctions can create this kind of siege mentality within the target country. It can rally the population around their leaders and make them less likely to compromise.
So instead of pressuring Russia to change course, sanctions could actually make them more defiant and entrenched in their position.
Exactly. And that can lead to this vicious cycle where each side escalates their actions, making a peaceful resolution even harder to achieve.
It's like when you back someone into a corner. They're more likely to lash out than to back down.
Exactly. And this is especially relevant when it comes to Russia. They have this strong sense of national pride and a history of resisting pressure from the outside.
So sanctions could backfire by fueling nationalist sentiment and making Russians less willing to compromise, even if it means facing economic hardship.
That's the worry. And it can be made even worse by how sanctions are perceived within Russia. If they're seen as unfair, arbitrary, or meant to humiliate the country, they're much more likely to trigger a backlash.
So it's not just about the actual economic impact. It's also about how sanctions are perceived. If they're seen as a form of economic warfare rather than a legitimate diplomatic tool, they're probably not going to be very effective.
Absolutely. And that's where messaging is so crucial. It's important to communicate clearly why sanctions are being imposed, what goals they're meant to achieve, and under what conditions they might be lifted.
So it's not just about using the stick of sanctions, but also about offering the carrot of potential rewards or incentives for cooperation.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, and it's not always easy to pull off in the middle of a geopolitical standoff.
No doubt, this is all incredibly complex.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to have these conversations to explore the potential downsides of sanctions and to think about how we can use them more effectively as part of a broader peace-building strategy.
I agree, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that there aren't any easy answers here. There are valid points to be made on both sides of this debate. And ultimately, the best course of action will depend on a careful assessment of the specific circumstances and the potential risks and benefits of different approaches.
It's easy to get caught up in, the big picture stuff, the geopolitics. But at the end of the day, these global issues, they really impact real people.
Absolutely. And that's something I think we need to talk more about. When we talk about sanctions, we can't forget about the potential humanitarian consequences.
Right, because when you're talking about these broad economic restrictions, there's always a risk of hurting ordinary citizens, people who have no control over their government's decisions.
Exactly. And that raises some serious ethical questions. Are we okay with inflicting economic hardship on innocent people just to achieve our own political goals?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. It's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, we want to hold Russia accountable, but we also don't want to punish everyday Russians who are just trying to live their lives.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act. And I think it really highlights the need for a more targeted approach to sanctions. Instead of these broad measures that can have all sorts of unintended consequences, we need to find ways to focus on the people who are actually responsible for the decisions we're trying to influence.
So are there ways to design sanctions that minimize the impact on ordinary people while still putting pressure on the people in power?
It's definitely a challenge, but there are some strategies that can help. For example, instead of these blanket trade embargoes, you could target specific individuals or companies, the ones that are directly connected to the regime. You could also focus on freezing assets held by corrupt officials or people who are profiting from the conflict.
So it's about being strategic and precise with how we apply pressure, not just about flexing our economic muscles.
Exactly. It requires a deep understanding of how the target country works, their economy, their power structures, their vulnerabilities.
It sounds like a lot of this comes down to intelligence gathering, figuring out the pressure points that will have the most impact without causing widespread harm.
Right. And it also requires a willingness to keep talking, to keep those communication channels open, and to explore other ways to resolve the situation. Sanctions should be seen as one tool among many in our diplomatic toolbox, not as the only solution.
So if we're thinking about a path to peace in Ukraine, what would that look like? Is it even possible to imagine a scenario where sanctions are lifted and relations between Russia and the West start to improve?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think any lasting solution would have to address the root causes of the conflict. The security concerns that led to this whole situation in the first place.
Okay.
We need to find a way to create a security architecture in Europe that guarantees the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, including Ukraine, but also recognizes that Russia has its own legitimate security interests.
That sounds incredibly difficult, especially with all the mistrust and hostility right now.
It is, but it's important to remember that history is full of examples of conflicts that seemed impossible to solve. Conflicts that were eventually resolved through dialogue, diplomacy, and compromise.
So there's still hope.
There's always hope, but it takes a conscious effort from all sides to move past the current stalemate, to set aside old grievances, and to focus on building a future based on cooperation and mutual respect.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. We started by talking about the impact of sanctions on Russia, and we've ended up discussing the very foundations of peace and security in Europe.
It's all connected. These seemingly separate issues are all part of a bigger picture, a web of relationships, power dynamics, historical forces.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about, but I feel like I have a much better understanding of how complex this all is. And that's thanks to you.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's always great to talk to someone who's so curious and engaged.
That's me, always ready for a good deep dive. And this one has definitely lived up to its name. We've gone way beyond the surface and explored some really deep and important issues.
And that's what it's all about, right? Going beyond the headlines, questioning our assumptions, and really grappling with the complexity of the world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. To everyone listening, we hope this conversation has sparked some new ideas and encouraged you to keep exploring these important issues. Until next time, stay curious, and thanks for joining us.